Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point.
All right, Justin. So welcome for a one-on-one podcast episode today. So today I would like to double click or deep dive on this topic of culture, particularly organizational culture, and why it can be so hard to change. So just for a little bit of context for the listeners out there, oftentimes we are called because of capacity challenges in an organization, right? We have too much demand and not enough capacity to meet that demand. So the business is growing, but the organization is struggling to have the capacity to meet the demand. And we often hear similar sentiments, right? We need to be more efficient. We need to figure out how to get performance to improve. We need to figure out how to get the team to be a little bit more autonomous, right? And at a higher level so that we can be more strategic as leaders or take the next step as an organization, right? So all of these sentiments are kind of bundled up in this notion of capacity challenges. But as you and I know well, no matter what problem they're trying to solve, culture is really the backside of the coin, right? It's just around the corner in terms of how we're actually going to solve those problems. So I want to ask you, as the man with the PhD in terms of educational psychology, right off the bat, how do you define culture in an organization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it all has to start there because people mean a lot of different things when they say the word culture. But I'm going to skip the PhD part for a second and just give a really basic example. So imagine you come home from work one night and your partner says, "Hey, we're going to a party Saturday night." Right? What questions are you going to ask? Okay, who are we going to hang out with? What's the occasion? Then after a while you're like, well, what should I wear? Should we bring anything? What are you asking in that scenario? Right? What you're asking is, how am I supposed to behave in that situation, and how am I supposed to show up? Right? And if it's a Halloween party, and everybody shows up in a costume and you show up in a three-piece suit, you're going to look like an idiot, right? And knowing what kind of party it is and knowing who's going to be there tells you a lot about what parts of yourself to bring. Now, that's just a really microscopic example, but what if the party you're going to is in Japan instead of the United States? That's going to tell you something about what might be happening at that party too, right? And so what you're really asking is, how do I fit in at this party? Wherever you are, whatever city you're in, whatever country you're in, whatever group of people you're hanging out with, whatever occasion it is. And this is ultimately the evolutionary root of culture. We as a species are designed to cooperate, right? We are a cooperative species. And the evolutionary roots of culture are really our human minds and bodies asking, how do I fit in with this group of people and learn from the survival skills that they have already figured out? So to take this back to nature, right? Let's say you were moving from one region to another, and this other region had different plants and different animals and a different landscape, right? So there are going to be totally different survival strategies that the people have figured out who live there. So when you go visit that place, what are you going to do? You're going to observe those people and find out, well, what plants do they gather? How do they prepare their food, right? What do they do for shelter? All of these observational skills that we have of watching how people do their thing are survival skills. And so they are hardwired into us. And so culture really just reflects the fact that wherever we go, we're going to try to figure out what everyone else is doing and try to do it like they're doing it.
So if culture is, this may be an oversimplification, societal norms, right? Orienting towards a space, right, that has a specific way of being or conducting themselves. What does that mean in the context of an organization's culture? How does it change when you're going from the society level to an organizational level?
Right. So an organization is not a totally closed system because it operates within a larger culture, but it means a couple of really important things. The first is it means that no matter what you're in, whether it's a house party or an organization, that culture is fairly automatic and unconscious, right? Like it's a behavior that we're going to manifest no matter what, right? The other thing is it's sticky. So if things are being done a certain way within an organization already, people are just going to keep imitating each other. It's going to be hard to change the way things are done there. So if you're not intentionally shaping the culture inside of your organization, what you have to know is that that process is happening with or without you, right? People are going to be picking up on unconscious signals from their leaders. And if they're not getting signals, they're going to be filling that vacuum with ways of being and behaviors that they learned elsewhere. So every organization has a culture, whether it's being done intentionally or not.
Yeah. And so how does one, particularly a mission-driven leader, go about fostering a healthy culture intentionally?
So it's really a three-step process. The first is getting really clear about the culture you want to have. The second is getting realistic about the culture that you currently have and then assessing the distance between those 2 points. And then third is actually working on that shift. And that means leading in word, in deed, and in every possible way the culture that you want to instantiate, because it's going to take a lot of work and it has to be done intentionally. And all of that sounds like a simple 1, 2, 3 process, but as you and I well know, it's not easy.
Yeah, there's an interesting, again, where we started the conversation, like the change management process. It's easy to put, new processes down on paper, but the particularly difficult part is getting the people in the organization to adopt those new processes. Okay, so you talked about this 3-step process, right? First is getting very clear about the culture you want. Second is getting honest about the culture you have. And then third is being intentional about how you're going to go from one to the other. So let's just start with that first part. What does it look like to get clear with the culture that you want?
Yeah, and you and I have a lot of experience with this process at this point, right? And it starts with a conversation. What's important here, right? What kind of company do you want to be running? Why did you start this business? Why did you start this organization? What is the root of this mission? Is at the end of the day, a successful culture is one that is going to serve the purpose that the organization itself was founded to serve, right? And especially in the mission-driven space, and a lot of the leaders we work with are mission-driven, leaders don't take a ton of time to think about that necessarily because the mission is so clear to them and often to a lot of the employees that it doesn't feel like something that requires a lot of thought, right? And then, of course, as organizations grow, as you and I well know, it becomes a little murkier and other behaviors set in that might not be serving the mission exactly the way you want it to. So really starts with that first big question. What really matters here? In the you asked me about my PhD. Well, in academic circles, they'll use buzzwords like values, belief systems, etc. But all you're really asking is, what are the most important things here? What is the mission? What do we stand for? And then from that, what are the strategic priorities or the business priorities that grow out of executing that mission? And then asking, how do we do what we do, such that we're prioritizing the things that matters most? And this is where the academic theorists are going to talk about things like behaviors and norms. They're going to talk about symbols and semiotics and rituals. But really, again, what you're asking is, how do people behave here? How do they do what they do? Now, where you and I think, differ from some of the theory on culture is a lot of the theorists talk about them being the unspoken rules or the unwritten rules. I think you and I are pretty much on the same page about the fact that the explicit rules and the explicit procedures for doing things are a huge contributor to culture too. What you and I would call systems, right? Because how you decide to design a work process, how you decide roles and responsibilities, how you decide compensation structures, those things contribute a lot to how people feel about the way things are done and what's important and what's being valued.
Yeah. And of course, the bigger the organization, the more challenging it can be to actually shift the culture, right? Because the more dynamics we have there. But I want to put a pin in that and save that because I know that's part 3. Okay, so first part is clearly articulating, where do you want to go? What's the culture you want to have? How do you want to cultivate it? The second part is realistically assessing the one that you've got. So, you said earlier that mission-driven founders sometimes don't take the time to think about this because the mission is super clear in their head. And I would absolutely agree with that. I think another reason that they don't take time to think about it is simply because they lack time, right? They lack the capacity to go through this thought process of what do I want? But what does it look like to realistically take inventory and assess the culture that you've got right now?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point that it's a hard thing for leadership to prioritize because things that seem more closely or directly connected to the bottom line, just they seem more urgent and you're going to put those fires out first. But also, it's not a skill set that a lot of executive leadership teams necessarily have in-house. So, consultants like us get brought in a lot to say, hey, can you do an assessment of our culture? And I'm a big fan of that. I think especially when you have a larger org, when there can be a good amount of distance between executive leadership and frontline teams, I think having that data-driven evidence for understanding exactly what is happening within your teams is really necessary for managing change at scale, right? You have to have a point A to know if you're getting to point B or not, right? That said, if you're doing the assessment, chances are you already know there is some kind of misalignment happening, right? Your spidey senses are telling you, or you're getting complaints coming up the chain saying like things are going wrong here, right? So you have a sense that there's a difference between your North Star, the culture that you want, and something that's going on. So I think it's really important to have that internal sense within leadership that leads the assessment, right? So for instance, just taking a really basic example, if you are a very customer-facing business and you've identified, like we can think of some of the clients we have, they really want to be customer service focused and they really want to do right by their stakeholders. If that's something that you know is really important, then your assessment has to start with some customer data. Assessments themselves are just tools, but where you point those tools is a reflection of what's important already. So that's really critical. You have to be designing your assessment with intention already. And, people might say, well, aren't you biasing the results? I'm telling you, as a researcher, the first place bias shows up is in choosing what questions to ask. There's no such thing as a completely objective study. So, and this is coming from a professionally trained researcher, so I'm just going to dispel that myth for everybody. The questions you ask are already framing the problem. But that's a good thing. When it comes to culture, you should have an opinion and you should be having certain questions being more important than others. All right. So once you've done that part, it's also critical to understand how the values that you've already begun to internalize are translating into every aspect of your organization, right? Like again, thinking about that humane approach to customers. What does that mean if you have this very humane approach to customers that you're trying to communicate throughout your organization, but the people inside the organization don't feel like they're being treated humanely? Again, coming back to where this conversation started, we are all highly attuned observers of each other's behavior and of group behavior. And so people don't miss anything. If you're going around saying, we are a company that's all about healthy living and healthy choices, but the people inside of the company are burning out and working 80 hours a week, people aren't stupid. They're going to say, hey, that doesn't track. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious. I want to double click on this point in particular because I think it can be easy to conflate mission with culture. And I think, maybe you would agree, maybe you would disagree, but one thing that we've observed, particularly in smaller mission-driven organizations, is that in the beginning, the mission serves as the culture, right? It's this cultural North Star. But as an organization grows and there become more and more people, more and more perspectives, it's less and less likely that mission will remain the single North Star, right? It's possible that other North Stars will pop up within the organization because there will naturally be competing priorities within the organization, right? It's a by definition a resource constrained entity. So I'm wondering if you can talk about this. It's a common challenge I think that we've observed is this kind of conflating, like, well, we have a mission, therefore we have a culture. How are those two things different?
The simple answer is the culture inside of the organization is designed to serve the mission. They're not the same thing. And let me explain what I mean by that. Again, let's just say we're an organization that delivers food to hungry people, right? That's our mission. Our mission is to feed the hungry. Now, if our organization gets really big and we have 500 people in 4 different cities, that means that we're going to have a bunch of internal systems and behaviors that are making our delivery of food efficient. In order for teams of people to do that delivery efficiently, speed might be something that we end up valuing, right? Communication with the organizations that we serve food to might be a really valued thing. And so you end up with these sub-values within the system, right? That are going to drive the way the customer-facing team works or the accounting team works. And those might not all, right? we're not all about feeding the accountants. We pay their salaries so they can feed themselves. So now you have some misalignment, right? You got a person who is a trained CPA who's showing up for a job, and they're just, doing their job and getting paid. And so now you have a bunch of different people operating with their individual values. You have individual values within functions within the organization. And so now you've got to come back to the mission and say, okay, what are the values and behaviors inside of this giant beast that are going to ensure that we still do a good job of delivering food to people who are hungry? Right. So culture is ultimately a tool. The tricky thing about it, and the reason we're even doing a podcast about the damn thing, is, like I said, culture related behaviors and senses are so embedded in our bodies and in our evolved brains that they're tricky to get a hold of. They're tricky to wrangle, they're tricky to tame, and they're tricky to change. So the ways of being that exist within an organization are complicated, and it takes a lot of work to identify them and train them and enculturate them. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, they're tools to achieve the mission.
Right. And so we're talking, the question was, what about the second part of like taking a realistic inventory, assessing the culture that you currently got? I want to take a little bit of a detour here, but I hope it's a way to also double click on this point. One thing that's popping up to me is this notion of like insiders and outsiders. Right. And so if we're taking an inventory or an assessment of our internal culture, what are the pros and cons of having an outsider's perspective in that process?
Well, pro, obviously, is that you're going to get somebody with a fresh set of eyes. One of the trickiest things about culture is that there's no way to take yourself outside of it if you happen to be someone who's living in it. You're the fish who's in the water. And so it's really helpful, as you often say, it's easier to read the label from outside the bottle, right? So the example I always give is, hey, have you ever been to a country that is completely different from your own? And you look at it and say, whoa, the way people greet each other is so different here. Whoa, the way they eat dinner here is so different. And then you repeat that to those people. Like you say, wow, like I remember going to Brazil as a teenager, and I was so impressed that meals were served collectively all the time. You've heard of churrasco, right? And this is a very, basic tradition in that part of the world, where instead of getting a giant hunk of steak on your own plate and eating it until you explode, the chef sits at the grill and just keeps grilling meat all night and then cutting up it into little pieces and passing plates around, and you eat it with your fingers, and you're just passing plates around for hours. It's a totally communal eating experience. And I remember thinking to myself, why don't we do this? And it's reflective of a very different culture. But when I said that to them, they were like, what do you mean? We do this all the time. They don't even think about it. So that's the upside of having an outside perspective. The downside, of course, is the person from the outside doesn't necessarily know where to point their gaze. And that's where it's your job, like I was saying a little bit earlier, to know what is important in your organization and be able to start to look for where there might be misalignments. Because as the outsider, I'm not necessarily going to know what's important to the leadership. I'm not going to understand the mission from the outside. And you have to tell me, we are here because our founder started this organization 50 years ago, and he got tired of seeing hungry people on the streets, and he wanted to do something about it. And so this is why we do what we do. And then as the outsider, I can look around and say, oh yeah, you have some behaviors going on here that aren't really serving your mission. We should think about that. This will help me figure out what questions to ask. And so you really need both perspectives.
I'm glad you actually used the word behavior, because we just had this conversation with a client this morning. Culture can be a very squishy conversation to have, but ultimately at the end of the day, the way to make it the most tangible is to end up talking about behaviors. So I think that's a good way to kind of ground this concept, for anybody who's listening. Okay. So
can I just double click on that one more time?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And behaviors are an aspect of culture. And what I would say is they're the manifestations of culture that we tend to care the most about when we're doing culture work in organizations, right? Ultimately, what you care about is how are people doing the work they're doing, and are they doing it in the way that's most aligned with the mission? And ultimately, that's a behavior question. Culture has many other elements, and those elements influence behavior, the ways we communicate, the way we design incentive systems, etc. Those are all elements of culture too. But ultimately, what the CEO or the director is going to care about is, are people behaving in the ways that are aligned with the mission?
Yeah. Yeah, good articulation there with the nuance. Okay, so we've got part number one, clearly articulating where we want to go. We've got part number two, clearly articulating where we are now. And then part number 3 is how are we going to get from where we are now to where we want to go? So I want to ask you a bit about how. And first I'm going to ask you just like a generalized how do we get there? And then I think I might double click on different size teams, because I'm assuming the how might be different if you've got a 10-person team or a 50-person team or a 500-person team. But in general, right off the bat, how does one start to map and take the steps from where they are now to where they want to go with culture inside of an organization?
Well, I'm going to use one of your favorite words, Ian, and this is probably going to be its own episode someday. The word is leverage, right? Behavior change is very hard. And so first you're going to identify, right, what is that distance between where we want to be as a culture and where are we right now? And then you're going to start to identify behaviors that need to change, systems that need to change, ways of being that need to change. And then you're going to ask yourself, what are the most important ones? What are really like the anchor behaviors or the anchor group dynamics that really are going to make the most difference in regards to accomplishing our mission? Again, it always comes back to that. We have to know where the North Star is. And again, just coming back to this kind of example we've been running with, effectively delivering food to hungry people, let's say. And let's say we determine that there's too much administrative backlog and things are moving too slowly and we're just not getting the service out the door. We're just literally not delivering food fast enough. Okay. And we're going to look at our culture and say, why is this happening? And maybe what we've realized is there are too many layers of administrative bureaucracy or something. And that has become actually like a cultural sticking point. People are too hung up on rules and we need to just get shit done, for lack of a better word. And so we're going to look and say, where in our behavioral patterns and group dynamics can we make that change as quickly as possible? So that's the leverage question, right? And then we're going to ask ourselves, what is it going to take to make people feel comfortable letting go of some of these rules they're clinging to? And that could, now you have a very tricky cultural question on your hands, right? We have a lot of people who are very attached to procedures and administrative tasks and rules. How are we going to get them to let go of some of that stuff? And now you're into the question of how do we incentivize it, right? Well, number one, we're going to incentivize speed. Maybe that's the way we do it. And we're going to say speed is more important than any of this stuff. And we're going to reward you for going fast. And we're going to not penalize you for breaking rules. I mean, I guess we just landed on a move fast and break things kind of deal, right? Which might not actually be a great idea in this hypothetical nonprofit I'm talking about. But you can see where I'm going. Ultimately, carrots and sticks, right? Can we remove sticks? Can we add carrots? And what's important to realize with culture is that the carrots and sticks are often less about punishment and financial incentive, although those certainly work, and more about social acceptance, social reward, tone setting, communication, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what do you say? We started this conversation with, oftentimes when we get called in, it's for capacity challenges, but culture is the backside of the coin. So what do you say to the leader, whether it's a manager or, an executive who doesn't have the capacity or doesn't have a ton of capacity to actually sit down and put pen to paper in a very intentional way, methodically over time? What are some things that person should be thinking about to still be able to have an impact and move the needle in their organization?
I think a really simple question that any leader can engage with is, what am I doing that is either reinforcing the culture I want to see or failing to reinforce the culture I want to see? So if your organization is growing and you're having a one-on-one or a two-on-one with a team member, and you just ask them, what do you think is the most important thing here? And see what they say, right? And you might find everybody's on the same page, and then you say, great. And then you can ask, yeah, but why aren't the group behaviors aligning if everybody knows what's important? Maybe they just know what to say, right? But it could be, and then you can ask deeper questions like, well, that's interesting. You agree and understand that feeding people is the most important thing here at Feed the Hungry, right? And yet we're not moving very fast. We're not getting food out the door. Can you help me understand why? And conversations as simple as that can start to surface the problems. And at the same time, you're also establishing mission-based alignment with that person. So they're probably feeling safe enough to have that conversation with you. But that just begins the conversation of getting to the root of why the culture is not aligned with the mission.
Okay, another question. What about in a company or a team where there's just the one sore thumb? It's the one person on the team who just doesn't fit in with the rest of the culture. What do you say to, again, a leader in an organization, because every organization has that person, right? What do you say to a leader in terms of being effective in addressing that cultural discord, if you will?
Can I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
Are we hoping to change the behavior of the sore thumb, or are we talking about managing the existence of this sore thumb among the rest of the team, or both?
What if I don't know yet? What if I'm a leader who's just at the beginning of this journey and I'm just trying to figure it out? And I haven't really spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether the sore thumb is actually the problem or whether the sore thumb simply isn't getting the resources that they need, to be effective.
I think effective is the word I would start with. Is this person a sore thumb in a way that is actually harming the mission? Again, for me, it comes back to that. If you have a person who is good at their job and just happens to be the kind of person who maybe raises issues in an uncomfortable way, that might not be a bad thing. Sometimes you have organizations where you have an analytical mind who recognizes problems and speaks on them. And that can be a useful person. The squeaky wheel is not always a bad thing, especially if they're good at their job. Now, I'll take that person every time, and I will try to work with them on their bedside manner and say, hey, the things you're saying are not wrong, but can we work on your delivery? And maybe we can put you in a position where the fact that you are very observant and analytical is a strength, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if you have a person who, while has a behavior that's a little divergent and it's actually not contributing effectively to the team, that's a totally different story. That's a person who may need to be on some kind of improvement plan, and they need to understand why. And ultimately, if you have people in important seats who aren't able to make the contribution you need them to make, then you might have to find that person a different seat or replace that person. And that's, those are hard decisions. But ultimately, like I said, culture is about serving the mission of the organization. And if you have people who are a drag on the mission itself, then you've got a real problem that needs to be dealt with.
Okay, so we started this conversation with that analogy about, if you're hosting a party, what are the rules and the expectations of the people attending the party? We talked about, in order to change the culture, we first need to know where we want to go and where we are now so that we can draw a path, right, from getting from one to the next. Are there any other final thoughts for someone who's, maybe a leader out there who's just starting to think about this and dive into this work and really take it seriously, in the sense of their organization is at a point in its development that now they need to take it seriously? Any other final thoughts, comments, questions to share with them before we wrap today?
Yeah, here's a really simple exercise. And I'm taking this from a client who really jumped on this idea and really liked it. Like you said, you're throwing a party. The analogy we started with was attending a party. But yeah, imagine yourself as a person who is throwing a fantastic party, but that party is about achieving a certain kind of mission. And then ask yourself, what kind of party am I throwing here? How do I want people to be? How do I want people to dress? How do I want them to show up at this place? So that we are accomplishing our mission. We're all super engaged. We're all having fun while doing it. And I, as the host, am really going out of my way to make sure every person who walks through the door knows exactly what kind of party they're being invited to and exactly what parts of themselves they're going to bring to make this party everything that everybody wants it to be. And so what is my job as the host? And how do I make sure everybody knows what kind of house they're walking into?
I think this is a great analogy because it frames, again, culture, which can be this kind of big, intimidating, daunting thing. How do I change it for the better? It's such a fun way to think about it, right? What kind of party am I trying to throw? What kind of party are we all attending? So that's awesome.
Yeah, and I have to give credit to the author, Priya Parker, author of The Art of Gathering, who is the inspiration for that. I'm sure she's not the only one in history to have related culture to throwing a party, but she is certainly the one who inspired me to use that metaphor. And I would highly recommend also to this fictional CEO to read that book.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Justin. Today was an opportunity for us to deep dive on organizational culture, what culture is, right? And what we can do about it. There's obviously a million ways that we could go with this conversation and, many layers that go much deeper. But for the sake of today, any other final thoughts that you want to share with the listeners?
No, just thanks for inviting me to your party, Ian.
It's been fun. It's small, but it's fun. It's a good time.
Maybe it was a coffee.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Ian.